Hello, my name is Tristan Girk, and I'm going to be presenting on the difference of empires between reality and fiction. We really want to see how the empires that we create in a fictional universe compare to those that we've had in the past to see if there's been any influence or carryover. The three empires we're going to be looking at is our first, the fictional one, Gallifrey. Then we will be comparing it to Rome and Egypt. Now, there are many key factors in the Roman Empire, but I narrowed it down to a few here. Emperor, specific laws, intense military. They're very well known for their culture, and they had a lot of innovation in their infrastructure. Now, as we studied in class, Rome conquered so much land, and this resulted in them becoming one of the most massive empires. However, this is part of what led to the downfall of Rome, that and probably lead pipes. But these key factors will be important in just a moment here. Now, with Egypt, we had a few key factors. They had pharaohs as their rulers, and priests also played a very important role. They were very much in the class system. They had essentially three classes, and from what my research turned up, it was hard to get out of the class you were in. They also function off of a 12-month calendar, and they came up with innovations for buildings and statues and hieroglyphics. So once again, another empire very focused on innovation, with essentially one ruler with a lot of classes. And then we will look at a few key factors of Gallifrey. I do not have time to explain the entire history of Gallifrey, but I will explain a little bit of it now. The planet of Gallifrey is a fictional planet from the television show, radio, and book series under the name Doctor Who. It is the home planet of the main character of Doctor Who, who's known as the Doctor. Gallifrey has technically fallen for the intents and purposes of this. And we will come back to how that ties in just a second. But some key factors of Gallifrey was that there was a high council of many different Time Lords from different families. However, there was still a president, and the president was less of a president and more of closer to a monarchy, with just a council under him. They had a very intense military. They spread their colonies over dozens and dozens of planets once they made their discoveries with time and space travel. Speaking of, they were very big into innovations, and I already touched on their colonization, and they had a very intense military, which was part of why they were involved in so many different wars. The one where Gallifrey fell was called the Last Great Time War, for good reason, because it is the last great time war. So let's make some comparisons here. We're going to set aside that one is reality, that two are reality and one is fiction. We're going to set aside the specifics of the innovations of our fictional one, because that would be an unfair comparison. And then we'll look at some of the important things, such as they all have one leading member, as I discussed. They each had a focus on innovations that improved them as an empire, and 2/3 of them involved very intense militaries and colonization, which was definitely something that we accepted as being a part of being an empire. So by looking at all of these, the knowledge that the Roman Empire fell because of war, in essence, and the Gallifreyan Empire fell because of war, in essence. And we look at the connections with ancient Egypt, with the pharaohs and the classes, because despite Gallifrey being the most civilized civilization in their own words, they still had a relatively close to three-tier class system. So I've already been talking about this a little bit. There's a lot of things that are for Gallifreyans based off the quote I've just told you, really thought that they were the best of the best. Obviously, that was not quite the case, but we've covered all of these two definitely combined together. And then in the against category, I struggled to come up with things for this, but I came up with a few, namely that there is a council under the president and they do have power. However, if we look at the American Empire, there are three councils under the president, and all three of them have power, and ultimately the president is still the ruling body. They did usually try to understand other species and have peaceful colonizations, at least at first. Eventually, they got confident and they stopped doing that. But there was a time in the early history of the Gallifreyan Empire where they tried to understand the other species who lived on the planets they had lands on and wanted to set up colonies on so that there could be peaceful relationship. And a final thing against it was that the Empire of Gallifrey is not monetarily focused because they do not have a monetary system in the way that any empire has. So they don't have that focus, which is different from Rome and from several other empires that we've talked about in class. So in conclusion, I would say that yes, Gallifrey does meet the criteria for an empire, at least by my own standards. Part of why I wanted to look into this was because they're called the Gallifreyan Empire in the show. That is what it's called. And I wanted to put to the test and see if they really would count as an empire or if they would rather count as a colony or a kingdom or just a planet of people. But after doing all this research, putting together my paper, and piecing together this presentation, there is not a doubt in my mind that the Gallifreyan Empire was very aptly named.